Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, June 21st, in the studios of Urbana Public Television in Urbana, Illinois. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. The name AWARE stands for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE was established almost 15 years ago after the counterattacks on New York and Washington of September 11, 2001 that killed 3,000 Americans. The founders of AWARE were citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that instead of going after the people who committed the 9/11 crimes, the U.S. government would use those crimes as an excuse for its already long-standing attempt to control the Middle East and its energy resources with military force, that is, by killing more people. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia. And so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. That control benefits only the American economic elite, the 1%, and not Americans in general, who've seen wealth concentrate in fewer and fewer hands at an accelerating rate throughout the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. So our program is based on the conviction that the U.S. government is lying about why it's killing people around the world. And it's lying primarily to the only enemy it really fears, the U.S. public. The U.S. government claims that our military, by far the most expensive in the world, is causing death and destruction around the world in pursuit of peace and freedom. In fact, the U.S. is protecting the worldwide economic control of the American elites, the 1%, which was established when the U.S. emerged as the only undamaged major country after World War II. The leading liberal U.S. diplomat wrote in a secret State Department memorandum at the end of that war, quote, "We in the U.S. have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. We would be better off to dispense now with a number of the concepts which have underlined our thinking with regard to the Far East. We should dispense with the aspiration to be liked or to be regarded as the repository of a high-minded international altruism. We should stop putting ourselves in the position of being our brother's keeper and refrain from offering moral and ideological advice. We should cease to talk about vague and, for the Far East, unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we are going to have to deal in straight power concepts. The less we're hampered by idealistic slogans, the better," close quote. Now, that was the liberal position at the end of the Second World War, and it is indeed the position that has been followed by subsequent administrations. It makes a mockery of the notion that the U.S. is protecting peace and freedom around the world. Following this policy, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people in 37 countries since the Second World War, and presidents have been consistently murderous up to and including George Bush and Barack Obama. If U.S. presidents were judged by the principles that led us to execute Nazi leaders at the Nuremberg trials, all modern U.S. presidents would have been hanged. And their pro-war, pro-Wall Street policies would undoubtedly continue under a second President Clinton. President Obama has attacked 8 countries, 2 more than George Bush, and his drone assassinations, called the most extensive terrorist campaign of modern times, have killed thousands of people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. The New York Times says that Obama himself chooses the people to be killed with drones from baseball cards of bad guys prepared for him by John Brennan, the former torturer who is now head of the CIA. In addition, the president commands through the National Security Council a 70,000-member private army, the Special Operations Command, which is active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, murder, and torture. The drone campaign and special operations are officially secret, and Obama's real political talent has been to distract Americans from his administration's war-making. In a book on the last presidential campaign, he's quoted as follows: "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine," close quote. However ironically he meant it, the quote has not been denied by the White House, and it turns out to be true. And whatever you may think of Donald Trump as a presidential candidate, he has presented a criticism of the Obama-Clinton war policies, as have Bernie Sanders and, even more, the Green Party's Jill Stein. Trump proposes instead diplomacy, he speaks of deals, towards forming partnerships, including with Russia, rethinking the mission of NATO. Europe's taking political and financial responsibility for its own crises, as in Ukraine, and an end to U.S. interventions around the world. Trump seems to be calling on an older Republican foreign policy tradition, an anti-war tradition excoriated as isolationism by pro-war U.S. politicians since the 1930s. Trump makes the elementary observation that the United States must share and balance power with other great powers, from Europe to Russia and China, instead of attempting to control the world economy with vicious and murderous allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel, as all recent presidents, including Obama, have done. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump's anti-war statements are part of their popularity. Remember that the anti-war movement in the U.S. was crucial to Obama's election both times, in 2008 and 2012, against McCain and against Romney. And Obama betrayed it both times by expanding the wars. The fact that Obama and most earlier presidents has worked so hard to obscure is that the American people have always been averse to war. Although the U.S. remains the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, as Martin Luther King said, U.S. presidents have had to lie and manipulate the populace into war all along. So the orthodox bipartisan establishment, Republicans and Democrats alike, have reacted with horror to Trump's anti-war proposals. Some 50 State Department officials have signed a memo calling on President Obama to launch air and missile strikes on Syria to assert control over the Middle East. In brief, to strengthen the hand of our diplomats and show we mean business, we should start bombing and killing Syrians. Of course, Syria has not attacked us, and Congress has not declared war on Syria or authorized an attack. Where do these State Department hawks think President Obama gets the authority to launch a war on Syria? Does the administration consider the Constitution to be purely advisory when it grants Congress the sole power to declare war? Was not waging aggressive war the principal charge against the Nazis at Nuremberg? If U.S. bombs and missiles rain down on Damascus to the cheers of the Obama-Clinton State Department, what do we do if Syria's allies, Iran and Hezbollah, retaliate with Benghazi-type attacks on U.S. diplomats across the Middle East? What do we do if Syrian missiles and Russian planes start shooting down U.S. planes? Do we go to war with Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia? Assume U.S. strikes break Syria's regime, and Syria's President Assad falls and flees. Who fills the power vacuum in Damascus, if not the most ruthless of the terrorist forces in that country, al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, and ISIS? Wherever across the Middle East we've plunged in to wage war, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Syria, people continue to suffer and die, and only for the profits of the 1%, especially the so-called defense industries. Last week, Russian planes launched airstrikes on the rebels in Syria, whom we've been arming and training to overthrow President Assad. We're arming terrorists, including al-Qaeda, in our attempt to control Syria and the Mideast. Russia's alliance with Syria goes back decades. Syria provides Russia with a naval base in the Mediterranean. Russian President Putin's support for the embattled Syrian regime and the civil war being waged against it is legal under international law. It is our policy that violates international law. Where did Obama get the right to arm and train rebels to attack the Damascus government? Did Congress authorize this insurrection, or is it just another CIA project? Meanwhile, last week, 31,000 NATO troops conducted exercise in Poland and the Baltic republics, right alongside the border with Russia. For the first time since 1945, German tanks appeared in Poland, this time under U.S. sponsorship. In living memory, Germany has attacked Russia twice across Poland, resulting in the greatest battles of the 20th century. Now we're planning to base 4 NATO battalions, one U.S.-led, one British, one German, and perhaps one Canadian, as the French and Italians are balking at being part of a tripwire for war. How would we react if 31,000 Russian, Chinese, Cuban, Iranian, and North Korean troops conducted military exercises across from El Paso and Brownsville, Texas? How would we react if each of these countries left behind a battalion of troops to prevent a repeat of General Blackjack Pershing's intervention in Mexico in 1916? Americans would be apoplectic. Nor are some Europeans enthusiastic about confronting Moscow. German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier called the NATO exercises warmongering and saber-rattling. Not only is Steinmeier's Social Democratic Party leery of any new Cold War with Russia, so too is the German Left Party and the anti-EU Populist Party Alternative for Germany, which wants closer ties to Russia and looser ties to the United States. This month, we sent the USS Porter into the Black Sea. Why? Says Navy Secretary Ray Mabus, quote, to deter potential aggression, close quote. While there is talk of a NATO Black Sea fleet, Bulgaria, one of the 3 NATO Black Sea nations, appears to want no part of it. The European Union also just voted to extend sanctions on Russia for annexing Crimea and supporting separatists in Ukraine. Donald Trump calls the NATO alliance a ripoff, a tripwire for World War III, and, in his words, obsolete. But Hillary Clinton compares Putin's actions in Ukraine to Hitler's actions in Germany in the early 1930s. If you're looking for a 4-year face-off with a nuclear-armed Russia, perhaps leading to war, Hillary's your candidate. We at AWARE think the Obama-Clinton administration shouldn't be able to hide its war-making from you, and that's what we'll talk about tonight, beginning with Ron Zook.
Let me spray you with a few headlines and maybe say a few words of interpretation about each and ask my colleagues here to comment on them. Some of these I may have mentioned before, but there's never time to make anything very detailed or convincing, I'm afraid, in a program of this kind. Thomson Reuters, London, June 8th, global violence worsens, driven by Middle East conflicts, and according to their peace index. The world has become increasingly violent, with deaths from conflict at a 25-year high. Terrorist attacks at an all-time high, and more people displaced than at any time since World War II. The 2016 Global Peace Index showed on Wednesday. The annual index, which measures 23 indicators indicating the incidence of violent crime, countries' levels of militarization and weapons imports, said intensifying conflicts in the Middle East were mostly to blame. But beyond the Middle East, the world was actually becoming more peaceful, researchers behind the index said. Quite often in the mayhem which is happening in the Middle East currently, we lose sight of the other positive trends, said the founder of the Institute for Economics and Peace, which produces the index. If we look at the last year, If we took out the Middle East, the world would have become more peaceful, he told the Thomson Reuters Foundation. More
trying
than
to take out the Middle East,
100,000
Alex.
people were killed in conflict in 2014, up from nearly 20,000 in 2008. Syria, where nearly 67,000 people were killed in 2014, accounted for the bulk of the increase, according to the index. The United Nations has said that the number of displaced people is likely to have far surpassed a record 60 million last year. The index showed that the most attacks that classed as terrorist were concentrated in 5 countries: Syria, Iraq, Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So those are some of the hot spots. I wanted to mention one that has not been getting enough attention, certainly from this program and in the American media, and that is the ever-worsening situation, the most open, it seems to be, class conflict, violent and murders in Venezuela. Venezuelans ransacked stores as hunger grips the nation. New York Times, June 19th. With delivery trucks under constant attack, the nation's food is now transported under armed guard. Soldiers stand watch over bakeries. The police fire rubber bullets at desperate mobs, storming grocery stores, pharmacies, and butcher shops. A 4-year-old girl was shot to death as street gangs fought over food. And Venezuela is convulsing from hunger. Hundreds of people here in the city of Cumana, home of one of the nation's independence heroes, marched on a supermarket in recent days, screaming for food. They forced open a large metal gate and poured inside. They snatched water, flour, cornmeal, salt, sugar, potatoes, anything they could find, leaving behind only broken freezers and overturned shelves. And it goes on and on in that vein. It talks about an earlier event in 1989, the nation's worst moment, this article says, which seared the memory of a future president, Hugo Chavez, who said the country's inability to provide for its people and the state's repression of the uprising were the reasons Venezuela needed a socialist revolution. Now his successors find themselves in a similar bind, or maybe even worse. The nation is anxiously searching for ways to feed itself. The economic collapse of recent years has left it unable to produce enough food on its own to import what it needs from abroad. Cities have been militarized under an emergency decree from President Nicolas Maduro, the man Mr. Chavez picked to carry on with his revolution before he died 3 years ago. If there's no food, there will be more riots, said Rabeles Enriquez, 19, who waited all day for bread in Cumana, where at least 22 businesses were attacked in a single day last week. This is an extremely bad omen, it seems to me, and leaves an opening for someone, guess who, to step in and say, we must do something about this disorder. We must bring order to Venezuela. Venezuela is said to have the largest petroleum reserves of any country in the world, which takes in a lot of territory, including, I was a little surprised to read that, including Saudi Arabia, which is often said to have the most extensive oil deposits. But anyway, the next point, I think I've mentioned before. Middle East again. U.S. is weighing whether to go after more targets in Afghanistan. 51 senior generals, diplomats, concentrating in the area of the Middle East, have recommended the increase in military action in the Middle East and Afghanistan in particular. So Obama so far has said that he's not going to send any more troops. What they have done is change the rules of engagement so that the troops who are there can begin shooting at, destroying, killing more targets. one I've mentioned before, the opinion by Paul Brandis in the Wall Street Journal, global jitters mean good time for defense stocks. So if you want to make some money in the current global anxieties, tensions, warfare, you can look for the big defense stocks of the big defense contractors or military contractors actually in this country. I think you know who they are. General Dynamics, General Electric, the Boeing, Rockwell, the usual list of suspects. Finally, there's so much here. In Okinawa, something we've mentioned several times before, anti-U.S. demonstrators march on Tokyo. Japanese protesters on June 12th demonstrated against the heavy U.S. military presence on the island of Okinawa as tensions run high after a base employee was arrested following the rape and murder of a local woman. This has happened a couple of times now. The big case apparently being in 1995 when a local girl, actually, she was only about 12 years old, was raped and murdered by American servicemen there. New York Times, June 19th. At Okinawa protest, thousands called for removal of U.S. bases. Tens of thousands of people on the Japanese island of Okinawa gathered on Sunday to demand the removal of American military bases in what organizers said was the largest demonstration against the United States presence there in 2 decades. The protest in Naha, the capital of Okinawa Prefecture, was billed as a memorial for a 20-year-old woman who was found dead last month. The United States Marine veteran who was working as a civilian contractor on the island has been arrested in connection with the killing, prompting a public outcry. Organizers said that 65,000 people attended the Sunday protest. That would make it the largest demonstration since 1995, when 2 American Marines and a Navy sailor were arrested over the rape of a 12-year-old girl, an episode that shook the tight military alliance between the United States and Japan and is still bitterly remembered by many Okinawans. So there are many more points here to be made. I would like to come back to and endorse some of the things said by Phyllis Bennis, who often writes interesting things about what's going on. This is from the Campaign for America's Future. In order to eliminate the threat of ISIS, the United States has to support eliminating the conditions that have led people in Syria and Iraq to conclude that ISIS is the lesser of 2 evils, said Phyllis Bennis, a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, in a Burning Issues video. Bennis has written a book, Understanding ISIS and the New Global War on Terror, that fundamentally questions U.S. strategy against the effort to build an extremist caliphate. Fighting ISIS militarily is not the only strategy, Bennis says. A credible plan for defeat ISIS starts with what every medical student learns in her first day in medical school. First, do no harm, stop the drone attacks, stop the airstrikes, and so on. And I commend that to you. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air, where our task is to talk about the wars that the U.S. government is carrying on that you don't hear about on the national news or in the regular mainstream media in general. We'll go now to Karen Aram.
And the pivot to Asia.
Okay, and pivot to Asia, yes. We've already been pivoting in that direction.
Right, so I'm going to comment on two of the statements that Ron has just made since they're related to Asia. One is Okinawa. I think it also needs to be pointed out that the Okinawans really don't want the Japanese in Okinawa. We don't seem to recognize the fact that the Okinawans are an indigenous people. of Okinawa. And they're not really happy with the Japanese presence there. And then the U.S. military bases that we're looking at building new ones in addition to the one that is already there, the big one.
Are they a
So-
Polynesian people?
No, they're an
No.
indigenous people. I mean, and you have to understand throughout Asia there are indigenous peoples, just like in Thailand. The indigenous Thai people are not Polynesian, but you know, they're not racially, DNA will prove this, they're not necessarily racially Chinese or Japanese Oriental either.
Same thing about Taiwan, right?
Yeah, the new president of Taiwan
Exactly,
is
is indigenous.
is half her family
Or
is
half.
Han, half
Right.
her family is indigenous.
Right,
Yes.
right, exactly. And it's difficult to tell because they tend to look alike, and so we said, you know, for us white
Right,
people.
they all look the same to me. right?
Well,
they say about
yeah,
us,
and to white people, exactly. I can often tell the difference, but again, they're so mixed very often that, yeah, anyway. But again, that is something to be noted. And I, again, have to emphasize the politics here is that, yes, we get this information coming at us every time that one of our soldiers rapes a woman or a girl in Okinawa, and they are becoming, I mean, it goes back quite a ways, ever since our occupation there, this has been happening. However, it's becoming more common, I think. And so we get this information. But make no mistake, it's political. A military base, a foreign military presence, a foreign military base on anyone's territory is politically anathema, because what they're doing is they're propping up and supporting the government that you may or may not support through their influence and their money. And I have no doubt that our military bases there are propping up the Abe government, which is very, you know, easily influenced by the U.S. But I want to go on to something you said, Ron, about Venezuela. And it's true, this is pretty horrific. In fact, Counterpunch printed a letter by Andrei Vilcek, and the letter is to China. And it's like a prayer to China to help Venezuela, given what's happening there. And it's very long, very beautifully written, and it goes into detail. I posted on Facebook. The only responses I got from anyone were from Chinese people. Not necessarily in China, though one can't be sure, but throughout Southeast Asia, saying that they then posted it and circulated, saying that they hope the Chinese government takes note of this. And it's because the Chinese government will go in with money, investments, etc., and food, because this is what they need, where we know what the U.S. government will do. We will go in with our military. Okay, and this would be used, just as you said, Ron, as a reason to occupy. Now, the problem that Venezuela, of the Chavez government, aside from being socialist and trying to alleviate poverty, is that they put all their eggs in one basket, focusing too much on their oil industry to support them. And agriculture really is necessary, food production, because if you can't feed your people, you will be dependent upon imports. And the imports are not coming in because the elites, the wealthy, and having lived in developing countries, I know how this works. They don't buy their imported goods in country with high duty on it. They shop outside of their nation. They go shopping to Europe. They go shopping all around the world. But things like toilet paper, I mean, no, I don't think they're coming back with stacks of toilet paper, but they can get it on the black market. There are many means to acquire the imported goods that they need, but they are the ones that are making sure, with U.S. support and provocations, that the imports are being blocked so that people are not getting the food. This is how you destroy a nation. And make no mistake, the U.S. is behind this. And I did talk about this maybe a couple months ago, not Venezuela specifically, but I talked about the pivot to Asia is being pivoted over to Latin America now. And it's not just Venezuela, but Venezuela certainly is suffering the worst consequences. Bolivia, under their socialist government, we'll call it socialist, they have a leader who's attempting to alleviate poverty. At least they are now fairly self-sufficient because they focused on agriculture. So we may not be as able to overturn them. We use other methods, as we know, Honduras, Ecuador, Nicaragua. There are a lot of problems facing Latin America now by the U.S. government interventions. Now, back to Asia, but it is related. It's very much related. But here's the latest article I get from Peter Simons, who is the Australian journalist with the WSWS, or the World Socialist website. He talking about our U.S. aircraft carriers now in war. Well, they've been in war games, but now in the Western Pacific. He said that the tensions over the South China Sea disputes during the past 5 years as a means of driving a wedge between China and its Southeast Asian neighbors is particularly with the Philippines and Vietnam is where our focus is now on the South China Sea, but it's also being broader now. It needs to be pointed out that the U.S. Navy has dispatched destroyers on 3 occasions within the 12 nautical mile territorial limits surrounding Chinese-controlled islets, provocations that could result in a military clash either accidentally or by design. Now here's the latest news that I have. Washington's real concern is to ensure freedom of navigation. Well, we know that's their usual propaganda. For its warships in areas immediately adjacent to the Chinese coastline, including sensitive naval bases on Hainan Island. The Pentagon's air-sea battle strategy for war on China envisages a massive air and missile attack on the Chinese mainland, supplemented by naval blockade to cripple the Chinese economy. He's making this statement. This is out there. He said, speaking yesterday on a panel discussing the next moves after the Hague ruling, which the Hague ruling is supposedly the Philippines suing China over the law of the seas related to some of these islands, even though they're U.S. lawyers. All the lawyers involved are U.S. lawyers, even though the U.S. is not a signatory of these agreements, nor is China. We know that China is going to completely ignore it because we know that the U.S. controls the International Criminal Court, or here it's referred to as the Center for, that's what I want to get across. The Hague ruling, according to Andrew Shearer, who is an analyst with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, declared that the current carrier deployment is a good step, but was not enough. He suggested that the U.S. military must shift into deterrence mode for the next 6 months to block any moves by China. Fellow panelist Amy Seawright declared there was no easy solution if China started reclaiming the Scarborough Shoal. Now, as I said, the decision from the Hague, which has been, I say Hague, sorry, Hague we say it.
I would say Hague, yeah.
Hague, yes, here. I sometimes apply sort of European accent to the words that anyway, it's the Hague in American English.
Well, maybe Hague is
English, I'm not sure. Anyway, the ruling, we know what it's going to be in favor of the U.S. or the Philippines, same thing, and we know that China is going to ignore it. The question will be, what will the U.S. do then, okay? Will they use proxy Philippines, or will they become even more belligerent than what they have been already? But in the meantime, the fact that we're continuing to deploy more ships and more provocations, and just the fact that this setup here that they're talking about is so close to naval bases on Hainan Island. I mean, anyway, the CSIS, this is new to me, it's the preeminent think tank of the U.S. pivot, working closely with the Pentagon and the Obama administration, okay, on the military buildup and strategy in Asia. Now, in March, 2 CSIS analysts published a Scarborough contingency plan that involved close collaboration with the Philippines and a public warning to China that the U.S. would intervene if the Philippine ships or aircraft came under attack. The plan's final step involves sending Philippine warships to physically block Chinese dredging operations with U.S. Navy assets in position over the horizon to signal that they would be prepared to intervene. Under Washington's Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, with the Philippines, completed earlier this year, the U.S. military has access to 5 Philippine bases. So speaking at yesterday's CNAS conference, Admiral Richardson, who's the Chief of Naval Operations, boasted that the U.S. Navy was expanding a lot of intellectual energy in determining ways to counter and disrupt Chinese activities in the region. From China's land reclaiming to its anti-access area denial, A2AD, weapons design to keep U.S. forces out of waters immediately adjacent to its mainland. So we're looking, it's very, very dangerous. Because if Richardson's comments are any indication, the Pentagon is preparing a series of reckless provocations that go well beyond the freedom of navigation operations that have already taken place. The result will be a further heightening of the risk that a small incident, whether deliberate or not, could escalate into conflict between the 2 nuclear-armed nations. Now, I did receive some information. I don't know if it's true or not. It's questionable, of the new president of the Philippines, Duarte, that he supposedly is definitely not going to follow U.S. orders and instructions. And he came up with something, oh, that was it. He actually asked China for permission for one of their ships to sail through that area, which would then make it legally a precedent. It would set a legal precedent for the Philippines acknowledging that that territory belongs to China. That was a posting I received. I've not been able, during research, to find anything that supports it. It would be very nice if that actually happened, because it would be tantamount to telling the U.S., bye-bye, you know, the Philippines, we've made our own decision here, and we're not going to provoke China into a armed conflict of any kind. So, but I don't know how true it is. I'm beginning to question things. So, well, I'm not beginning to question things. I'm just saying I wasn't able to find anything to that effect. But so things just keep heating up, and now with the U.S. Pivot to Latin America, and as you say, things are very, very serious in Venezuela, and let's see if China does intervene and try to help the Venezuelans. It's to their interest, because Venezuela is so rich with oil. On the other hand, and we know that China wants to have more involvement in Latin America. On the other hand, I don't think China wants to get involved with any more provocations with the U.S. So.
I think the deposits of oil have a lot to do with the crisis in Brazil as well, because everyone
of course, yeah.
And the elite is charging everyone else with corruption.
Right.
In connection with the Petrobras oil
and
seed
the
oil
BRICS.
company.
And the BRICS. Brazil is the first one to knock out of that. I don't know which. I mean, we know that the oil resources are number one important criteria, but the BRICS being
People
set up.
don't seem to realize these oil deposits are a real curse on a country. That Nigeria, for example, has it improved the life of the ordinary people?
No,
typically
not at all.
not. They're the most corrupt and poverty-stricken countries in the world, typically.
Right, right.
But we can't ignore the extent to which the U.S. is the prime mover behind this this situation. I mean,
Absolutely.
we've pointed out before that the U.S. Doesn't need oil from the Middle East, but the reason is the U.S. gets most of its oil. The foreign oil that's imported into the U.S. comes from the Atlantic Basin, which is West Africa, Nigeria, Venezuela, Canada, and this is sufficient for the needs of the U.S. The other oil wars that the U.S. has carried on for a long time have been a matter of controlling other countries. If we control the flow of oil to Asia, to Europe, we have a stranglehold over these countries that are economic competitors of the United States. That's the real interest of the U.S. That's the real reason the U.S. is interested in oil. And I heard an interesting suggestion that set of circumstances are arising in the world oil trade that may really account for the pivot to Asia by the Obama administration. I mean, when someone sits down to write about the particular way in which the Obama administration has made war and around the world, they'll notice, first of all, that the Obama administration's war policy is perfectly consistent with the policy of the administrations that went before, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the first Bush administration, and so forth, but that the question of tactics does vary. For example, there's a lot of evidence that the U.S. is responsible for the tremendous fall in the price of oil a year ago that was engineered primarily by Saudi Arabia, the U.S., one of the two U.S. Principal clients in the Middle East, the other, of course, being Israel, and that the U.S. has been playing oil politics that way for a long time, and it is certainly doing so against Venezuela. I'm surprised in a way that we talk about the troubles Venezuela has right now without first mentioning the fact that the U.S. is working avidly to destabilize the Venezuelan government as it has for a long time. And the fall in oil prices has aided the U.S. policy and indeed may be a direct result of U.S. policy. One of the reasons the U.S. wanted to encourage a fall in oil policy is that it injured the primary enemies, the primary economic competitors of the United States, Russia, and in the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela. The U.S. has been trying to do in Venezuela for a long time what it did manage to do in Ukraine, that is, overthrow a legitimately elected government and establish a government which was responsive to American foreign policy needs. The U.S. actually sponsored a coup in Venezuela and got President Chavez thrown out of office and indeed imprisoned, but the Venezuelan people saw there was a popular reaction to what the U.S. was doing, and Chavez was returned to office.
Yeah, after only about 3 or 4 days.
Exactly.
Right?
Right.
But the problem is that the U.S. policy, Rust never sleeps. U.S. policy hasn't changed. The U.S. policy continues to try to destabilize Venezuela, and when the going was good, when Venezuela could sell its oil around the world during the actual Chavez regime, when Chavez was president, this wasn't a problem. It is a problem now, probably as a result of American policy, and Maduro is suffering from it. But the U.S. is busily trying to undermine this government, this country. And in fact, the principal support for Venezuela in many ways is indeed China, as Karen was pointing out. Most of the foreign debt of Venezuela, China holds more of Venezuela's foreign debt than any other country. The U.S. makes it clear that the IMF and the U.S. banks themselves will not lend to Venezuela. After all, they're bad guys. But so China has stepped in and been the primary lender to the Venezuelan government. That's the source of the article that Karen was talking about, where an author on the Counterpunch website was calling on China to support Venezuela further in its struggle with the United States. But I think anything we see about the disorder in Venezuela, we have to understand that the United States is primarily behind it, and it's using domestic comprador. I mean, the Venezuelan elite that always hated Chavez is now being armed economically and directly by the U.S. So,
what do you think of the chances of a major political event in Venezuela in the next 30 days? I would bet on it.
Well, in the sense of an overthrow of Maduro,
Right.
it is certainly possible. The U.S. is working for it. And that's why there's been this call for China and others to step up and support the legally elected government of Venezuela, just as they should have supported the legally elected government of Ukraine.
The question is, how does China, other than foreign investment that they put in, money-wise, I don't see China wanting to get too involved, preventing any kind of a coup, military coup. because that's not their thing. They don't want war. They don't want confrontation with the U.S. So I'm not sure how far they can go on that. They will invest, they will make loans, they will build infrastructure, but I'm not sure where that would lead. Question, Carl, does what we're talking about, Venezuela and Russia as being two major oil suppliers to the world, would that not also include Iran?
Well, exactly. One of the reasons that the principal reason that the U.S. has wanted to do the Iran deal is to reincorporate Iran into the world organization of the oil market that the U.S. has had for all practical purposes since the Second World War and lost a big chunk of when the Iranian Revolution took place and have been working in various ways to get that back by hook or by crook. The deal with Iran is primarily concerned with getting Iran to cooperate with American control of energy flows. The nuclear deal, as it's called, really has very little to do with nukes of any sort. It has a great deal to do with the control of oil. Now, this leads to the point that, as I say, struck me as interesting a week ago. I haven't heard much comment on this, but there was a report for the Canadian government, the new Canadian government, a big study about the long-term prospects for oil. And what the report shows is that the renewable energy of all sorts around the world, it doesn't include nuclear, but renewable energy is bringing down the price of energy far faster than anybody thought it would. Wind power, solar power, and so forth, and the developments along that line, and even other more exotic forms of renewable energy, is working much better than anybody expected. And so the Canadian government says, look, our economy is largely dependent upon oil too, and this oil is going to be worthless before long. We got to start thinking about it. Saudi Arabia has made the same commitment without any reference to renewable energy, but just saying that they are pivoting away from dependence upon oil and establishing an economy which is not so dependent on oil. Now, if this is true, if the Canadians are right, if we really are reaching an energy situation in which the present slight resurgence in the price of oil is temporary and oil drops off a great deal, then that changes things in a lot of ways. And there are people who are suggesting that the Obama administration, seeing this possibility some years ago, exercised its pivot to Asia, realizing that the control of energy flows to Asia, which has been the primary whip hand that the U.S. had over China, is not going to work anymore. And therefore we need other things, primarily military, and the way that Karen has been describing for a while now in this program, in order to control the competition, the economic competition with China. And anyone who looks at American history has to notice that economic competition for control of China may be the most long-standing aspect of American foreign policy. It goes back to the so-called open door policy at the end of the 19th century, when Americans who had moved across the continent in a so-called manifest destiny fashion didn't stop at the border of the Pacific, but went on across the Pacific. That led to that unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s, for example. But even before that, the U.S. had determined that the economic expansion of the United States would not just take in the American South, as it did in the Civil War, would not just take in the Pacific, as it did in the Pacific War, it would also take in China, and the control of the Chinese economy was paramount for the profits of the American elite. Now, what's happening in the current Chinese government is that they're what they call their One Belt, One Road program, which is basically a program of economic integration across between Asia and Europe, as Karen has been describing, is consciously set against this American control of the world economy that's existed since the Second World War. That's the real global contest that's taking place. And hey, they know that in Washington, and they know that the primary weapon that they've been using in Washington, control of oil, isn't working anymore.
Yeah. Well, this does have a long history, going back 2 centuries, to the role of the missionaries
Right.
and the gunboats on the rivers in China and so on, the Opium
sure.
War.
Can I mention a book?
Missionaries had much, yeah.
Yeah, a book that I just started reading. It's by James Bradley. It's called The China Mirage. It just came out 2015. And the reason I'm reading it is because I saw him interviewed on RT, on Crosstalk. And he was so on the same page as we are regarding China and Asia. And he, along with Peter Lavelle, against 2 other Peters who were U.S. academics that, one, I actually saw him out and out lie, okay? That really made me angry. But at any rate, James Bradley had written Flags of Our Fathers previously. His father was one of those soldiers who is pictured raising the flag on Iwo Jima. So I was rather surprised because this book, this is not fiction, this is real, and it's dealing with exactly what you were just mentioning, and gunboat diplomacy, and I've only gotten into the introduction, so I shouldn't really talk about it, but for people who like their history to be exciting, I mean, the first page he talks about the former Delano Roosevelt, whom FDR was named after, was involved in the opium trade. I mean, I was like stunned. So I knew that Jardines had settled Hong Kong, and that Jardines was a Scottish firm at the time, and since then they've become totally legit because they were one of my clients in Thailand, and they've spread out into so many different industries. But they were originally the shipping company that transported the opium and founded Hong Kong. But knowing that our president had some, his grandfather, Delano Roosevelt, was involved, or Delano was involved in that, not the Roosevelts. Anyway, it's an interesting book, and James Bradley clearly is someone who is on the same page exactly as we are in relation to U.S. Hegemony and imperialism related to China. And I have a question I want to ask quickly relating to the oil resources. You were talking about Nigeria being one of the top oil resource nations in Africa, and that's why I saw immediately when the U.S. was talking about sending in the military, because we had to address the Boko Haram kidnapping of the girls. I thought, since when do we care? And of course, we've set up AFRICOM all over Africa, and we keep sending in more and more military, and every now and then, and I even saw it on RT, which disturbed me, was something about Boko Haram and how the U.S. military, we didn't move quickly enough to go in and take care of them. And the one other nation besides Iran, well, let's just deal with Nigeria now, because Africa is so important, and actually all of Africa and the nations there where we have set up so many military bases is, I mean, China. I mean, here again, we've got the competition. China has actually said, okay, the U.S. has forgiven some of your loans to some of the African nations that are so indebted, but we will actually give you interest-free loans, okay, totally free of interest. And then in some cases, they will turn over the infrastructure that they're developing after maybe 50 years or something, turn it over to that nation completely. So I just wonder if either of you have any comments on Africa in relation to China right now.
No, it's been pointed out a number of times that these nations that have oil resources are among the most miserable and poverty-stricken in the world,
Right.
because of these resources are dominated by a tiny elite at the top,
Right.
who are just impossibly corrupt.
And supported by the U.S. government, exactly.
So all we keep hearing from Nigeria and these other places is the people who have been trying to penetrate and drain off some of the pipelines and setting off explosions and fires and so on. These people are so miserable that they're trying to obtain some fuel in that way.
Yeah, it's really pathetic. I mean, one other question, in relation to Saudi Arabia, Carl, I think also that they're responsible for, curbing the oil price, probably in discussion with the U.S. in order to, hurt Russia and Venezuela. The question is, they are hurting themselves, and evidently, and they are not self-sufficient when it comes to imports. I mean, they're out in the desert there. And I did read somewhere where they're looking at doing a new industry, but the new industry is refining So I don't know, because, you know, how long can they go? They have huge families and elites that they have to support. So I really don't know enough about Saudi Arabia. And,
One of their new industries seems to be the Clinton campaign.
Yes, yes, of
Reports that
course.
20% of the financing of the Clinton campaign
Right.
comes from Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Based on the notion that having a friend in Washington will be good for the Saudi royal family. And if it's the American royal family, well, that's fine. So it's,
Okay, if we have any time left, I want to make a number of minor points. A headline, NBC News, huge NATO drills in Poland prepare West for possible conflict with Russia.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Western Poland,
Amazing.
red tape marked the explosive charge that the U.S. soldiers set on a plywood to breach the door of a brick house and so on. Repeated shouts of fire in the hole rang out, loud boom and so on. The furious activity at military bases near Wedrin, I can't pronounce that. Polish always looks like a jumble of consonants to me.
it does.
Yeah, was part of one of the biggest NATO exercises since the end of the Cold War. Some 30,000 troops and numerous vehicles, aircraft, and ships from more than 20 countries are involved in the show of force aimed at reassuring U.S. allies unnerved by Russia's actions in nearby Ukraine. So, okay.
Mention the market we have coming up this Saturday.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that. Any reports on the People's Summit in Chicago?
No, but I think we'll have to delay a count on that. We have one or two other announcements to make, including an evening of story, music, and inspiration on the Saturday, the 9th of July, with Kathy Kelly from Voices of Creative Nonviolence in Chicago. Kathy is a friend of this ground, and we are delighted to have her in town on the evening of the 9th of July. We'll mention it again between now and then, but that's at the Channing Murray Foundation, and AWARE is one of the sponsors of this evening of story, music, and inspiration on the question of creative nonviolence, opposition to America's wars, with Kathy Kelly. You mentioned the fact that AWARE will be present at the market on Saturday.
Yes, this Saturday.
And what other events do we have coming up that should be mentioned?
That's it.
You've been watching AWARE on the Air, presented by members and friends of AWARE, the Anywhere, Any Racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 25th week of 2016. Another week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has yet seen, is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for AWARE for articles referred to by the panel and announcements of upcoming events. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. This is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zook, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.